Hey guys, it's Nicole here from Toujours and welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to be taking a closer look at our relationship between the meringue strength and our macaron shells. So specifically today I'm going to showcase what it does to our shells to under whip our meringue and also over whipping our meringue. Before we get into this video, I want to give a disclaimer. I am using my normal macaron recipe. If you haven't checked that out, it is in the description of my Macaron 101 video. You can click on that up there. But I did take out my egg white powder. So since the egg white powder strengthens the meringue so much and gives you a lot more leeway in when your meringue is done, I took it out so we could better demonstrate what the effects are of under whipping and over whipping are. So let's get into under whipping our meringue and see how that affects our shells. We have the final products here. We will take a closer look on the insides after this video. Let's get into it. All right, so let's focus in on under whipping our meringue and how that affects our final shell. So here I have all my ingredients as normal, my regular recipe. I am just omitting my egg white powder. So I've got my sugar, my egg whites, and my confectioner sugar and almond flour with a piping bag fitted with a piping tip. I'm just doing circles here, so this is a 10mm tip. And I have my mat prepped and everything ready to go with my oven preheated at 300 degrees Fahrenheit. And now I'm going to purposefully under whip my meringue to see how that affects my final product. So I'm whipping up my egg whites, and once they're nice and foamy, I add in the granulated sugar. And once that granulated sugar is nice and dissolved, you can add in your color at this point. Here I'm adding Master Elite Lilac from the Sugar Art. And I just like to use powdered colors so I know that this is not going to affect my shell. That is a factor I don't have to worry about. If I were to use too much gel paste, I could have a soft shell at the end of my product. So I want to make sure I'm using a powdered color. I'm not adding moisture. I don't have to worry about that causing any harm to my final product. If you're in the market for new colorants for your macaron shells, I highly recommend the Sugar Art Master Elites for macarons. You can use Toujours at checkout and save yourself 15% off. So I added a little bit of lilac, as you can see, and keep whipping up until I reached soft peaks. So this was very difficult for me to stop as I was whipping at this point, but as you can see, my whisk leaves some striations in the egg whites, but as the whisk leaves that area, they do die down. It doesn't keep the striations. As I lift up my hand mixer, the meringue on my beaters is falling over at a medium to soft peak. So we're nowhere near a stiff peak at this point, and we're gonna see what happens if we mix in our dry. Again, usually I would whip a few more minutes here until the meringue holds its shape on the top of the beater. I would want that to be a nice peak, but here it is drooping over and it's not holding shape, but we're gonna go anyways. So I'm adding my dries into this mixture and I'm being super careful when macaronaging because there's not that much air in it already. So I don't want to deflate too quickly or else I won't have a sturdy batter at all. But once I get all my dries incorporated, I start the deflation process or the macaronage process. And here I'm being super careful because I'm already at a pretty loose consistency. So I macaronage to the consistency I usually prefer to. It's nice and flowy, but not too fluid. I want it to still feel thick. And it looks fairly good. I was surprised that it wasn't more runny with how loose the meringue started. So we put it in our piping bag and I'm piping them out. Whenever you're doing something different, I always recommend piping your first 2 or 3 shells on your mat and just see how it spreads, because you don't know if you're using something different, if it's gonna be outrageously loose or what. So you want to be cautious. Take a look at what it does on your mat and then continue to go so you can adjust accordingly if it's a little bit more runny. Once I saw that the batter wasn't overly spreading, which surprised me, I kept going and piping the full tray. So since I'm using no rest method here, I popped these into the oven and lowered my temperature to about 295 Fahrenheit just to keep that internal temperature around 300, because with these air bake trays you don't want to bake too low or else you'll get concave shells. When it was the halfway mark, around 10 minutes, I flipped my tray around and set my timer for another 10. Once they were fully baked, take them out of the oven and they looked okay. The tops, as you can see, are a little translucent and the feet were not as clean as usual. But if just by appearances you were looking at them, you'd probably think, oh, those are doable. So I put them to the side, let them cool, and I started my over whipping process to see what would happen here. I felt like this meringue took forever. Finally, I got to a consistency where I felt like it was as stiff as it could be. It was super thick. It was hard to even get my hand mixer in the bowl through the meringue. As I pick up my hand mixer, the meringue is not going anywhere. It is stiff in the bowl. It is stiff off of my beaters. This is where I start to macaronage, and it feels fairly normal for me relative to the soft meringue. This batter feels so much thicker and just stronger. In order to get to the flowing consistency that I strive for, I had to macaronage more than when I had the weaker meringue, the softer meringue, and then piping and baking. 300 Fahrenheit for about 20 minutes, flip it at the midway point, and voila. The results of these macarons surprised me. They looked beautiful. They had taller feet than I usually like, but other than that, they looked to have a sturdy shell from the outside, nice clean feet. So once these cooled, I compared my under whipping and my over whipping shells together and noticed that there was a slight hollowness to my over whipping. However, it wasn't as apparent as I expected. It still had a very sturdy shell, a nice fullness inside, and the appearance was nice. Whereas the under whipping had quite a brittle shell, was also hollow, and the feet were not as clean as I'd like them. Since the result of the over whipping of the macarons wasn't very dramatic, I wanted to try one more time. But with that in mind, it was definitely hard to over whip my meringue. You have to whip for a long period of time and get it so past thick in order to really make it hinder your product. So here we go. We're going one more time. I'm over whipping my meringue and taking it even further than the last time. Now look at this final product of my meringue. Super clumpy, has lost its shine, and doesn't even have a point anymore, really. It's just clumped. No elasticity whatsoever in my meringue anymore. Here we go, putting in my dries into this meringue and doing a nice macaronage. It's still thick. The flowing consistency took a long time to get there, so I thought maybe even this could work. So I piped, baked, and the result of this extreme over whipping of your meringue was quite dramatic, and the shell was very brittle. I definitely was able to see how that could destabilize your batter just as much as under whipping your meringue. They still looked fine as you pull them out of the oven. I was like, oh, maybe it actually worked. But as soon as I put my finger on them, I could tell the shell was not sturdy because of the destabilization of your meringue when you over whip and also when you under whip. You're not developing that tight structure of your meringue, and it allows very little time to play with your batter to get it to the right consistency without it being too weak and having your shells in turn be very weak. So look at, this was my over whipping of my second batch. I just put them all in here because I'm gonna make some brownies with them after or something, but they are just pulverized. They're not worthy of filling, okay? But I did fill my under whipped and my first attempt at over whipping, and I wanna see how they bite after being matured, because these definitely crumbled as you tried to cut into them after baking. Now these have been maturing for 48 hours. I actually can't tell that they are super brittle. Now these are the ones I over whipped the first batch. Filled with chocolate ganache, both of them, because I wanted them to have the same moisture content of the filling, but both taste the same. So if I just push down, it does get a little bit cracked here. Maybe you can see that. So the shell is gonna be a little bit more fragile when you package it for your customers or whatnot. But other than that, you could totally sell both. So to wrap it all up here, I would say that there is a wider range for your meringue than I thought. You can do a fairly soft meringue all the way to an extremely stiff meringue and still have a final product that is worth selling. The thing you have to worry about more when you have a softer meringue is when you're macaronaging. You don't have any room for error there. You don't have a lot of time to mix in your dries and to deflate without it getting too runny. I would say a stiff peak would allow you more time to macaronage and not have to worry about it. You're going to be susceptible to more errors and bad shells if you underwhip. Now, over whipping, there was a lot more time than I expected to claim like what over whipping is. I had to whip the crap out of my meringue to get it over whipped. With the extremely over whipped meringue, it was so destabilized that it produced a shell that wasn't even worthy of being filled. So you wanna make sure you don't get to that point. But other than that, you have a fairly big section to play with and to see what works best in your environment. So some say they do a medium stiff peak, some super stiff. It really is up to how much you macaronage, how quickly you do that, and how carefully. So it really depends on the baker, but I feel like this is encouraging because you can make a wide range of stiffness of meringue work for you. So thanks so much for tuning in, you guys. I hope this was informative. Please hit that like button and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. I hope you have a wonderful day and happy macaron making.